Community Engagement Associate for the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. I will be your moderator for today's webinar, Getting Your Grant Proposal Budget Right, Understanding Budget Basics. Before we begin, I want to just briefly cover some instructions on how to ask questions through GoToWebinar. On your screen, you should be able to see the control panel on the right side of your desktop. The control panel automatically collapses with only the Grab tab displayed. You can use the double arrows at the very top to open and close the control panel, which then houses the questions panel. Throughout this presentation, please think of questions you may want to ask and type them into the questions panel. We will then use 20 minutes at the end of this presentation for a question and answer period. In addition, we will then send out the slides and evaluation after the end. There is one primary objective for today's webinar: to be able to define and understand key budget terms and develop a basic program budget. Now I would like to take this time to introduce our expert, Ann Chung. She is the Community Engagement Initiatives Director at the Asian and Pacific American Health Forum. Ann has over 10 years experience writing grants at the federal, state, foundation, and corporate level. At the Health Forum, she has led numerous grant proposal teams for grants to the Department of Health and Human Service and Office of Minority Health. Prior to coming to the Health Forum, Ann worked successfully with grant writing teams at local community-based organizations in Atlanta, Georgia, and Cleveland, Ohio. Her primary budget tip is to follow instructions and match the budget with the goals and objectives. Now I would like to introduce Ann to share her knowledge on budget basics.
Thank you very much, Marietta. Good afternoon and happy Wednesday, everyone. First, I'd like to start with some polling to see who else is with us today virtually. So on your screen, there will be a quick poll. What region are you from? Please click on what region you're from. I'll give you a few seconds to click, and we will show everyone on the screen where are we coming from today. Great. Okay. So as you can see, that about 20% of us are coming from the Midwest, 26% from the Northeast, 22% from the Southeast, 7% from the Southwest, and 26% from the West Coast. So welcome everyone to the call today. I know that there's probably still more people who are calling in as we continue on. Next slide. So the second question I have, let's see who else is in this virtual room, is what sector do you work in? So are you from a nonprofit, a community health organization, government agency, federal, state, local, university, or other? So please take a few seconds to select what sector you work from. Okay, great. Let's see who is with us today on the call. So it looks like a good majority of us on the call are from nonprofit organizations, about 62%. There seems to be some of us from community health centers, 8%, another 8% from government agencies, 12% from university and research institute, and 12% for others. For those of you who are marked other, please use the question box and just let us know what other sectors that you work in. Thank you. So my next question for the group is, please answer this question. My organization has someone responsible for fiscal matters and helps to create grant proposal budgets. So no, kind of, yes, or yes, it's me. So please fill in your poll. Okay, just a few more seconds as everyone logs in their answers. Okay, so we'll reveal a little bit more about this group today. So it looks like almost majority of you do have someone responsible for budgets at your organization, which is really good. 30% kind of, 15% no, and a very small percent say yes, it's me. So whoever is the group that said yes, it's me, I look forward to you also sharing some of your best practices and tips. So it looks like the good number of us kind of have someone who is responsible for finances, or do have someone, and that's pretty average of what's going on right now in nonprofits. Okay, so thank you everyone for participating in our early poll about who's on the call. So first, what is a budget? A budget is simply a financial expression of your project. So whether you are helping to register people for health insurance, you're organizing community fitness classes at a local elementary school, you're providing in-language health education classes, or you're establishing community gardens, all need funding and all need a budget. Yet many people are intimidated by this part of the grant application. So to demystify the process, today's webinar is designed to help you consider the kinds of items of cost that may need to be included in your program budget, and for you to have an opportunity to ask questions. We have a special guest expert today, Juliet Espinoza, which is our Health Forum, the Asian Pacific Islander American Health Forum Senior Director of Finance, who will be here to share her tips and also answer questions that you all may have. So again, throughout this presentation, please type in your questions on the bottom right section. And again, we'll spend a good amount of our time at the end answering your questions. So the budget section is really your opportunity to build your case for funding. Some may even say that this is the heart and soul of your grant proposal. Always remember that good writing can go a long way in your grant proposals, and good numbers can too. Next slide. So your program budget. Your program budget should be realistic and reasonable. It should be a realistic and reasonable estimate of the funds required for you to achieve your program's objective. Again, a reasonable budget that will support your projects well. Your program budgets are how you communicate to your funder what exactly you will do with the funding dollars that have been awarded to you. It shows funders exactly what they want, what they will support, and where their money will go. Also, this is your opportunity to specify other sources of funding. So in some cases, committed funding can provide leverage to influence the grant to have new or additional dollars. So, we always talk about the value of diversifying funding, and so oftentimes it's really good to show in your budgets that you have funding coming from other sources. One note is to be careful with in-kind contributions. Just make sure that you promise the very minimum of what you think the funder would like to see, but that is also realistic for your agency. In-kind contributions, for those of you who may not know what that means, are the resources that are not actual dollars, but resources necessary to run the program, like donated space, donated supplies, volunteer time. All are needed and show the funder that they are not the sole supporter of this work. Some funders will provide you, will hold you to your in-kind contributions. So again, please be very realistic about what you're writing down about the contributions of what people are providing. Okay, finally, your program budget serves as a plan of how your organization will operate the project. So remember, a plan is just a plan. The actual implementation may be slightly different. The reality may be different from a plan, but a plan is needed and necessary to guide staff through the implementation. Just an FYI that the budget is almost always negotiated when you get a federal fund. So, what you propose, there will always be a period of negotiation. Budgets also serve as a basis for the end of the year grant report. Okay, next slide. So earlier, one of my greatest tips is really to follow instructions. Budgets can be the simplest part of the grant, but it also trips so many people up. If you get nothing else from this presentation today, it's to read, reread, and reread your funding announcements or your request for proposals. When you read the funding announcements, all throughout, they give you instructions, and as much as you can follow those instructions will be the best tip that I can give you for creating budgets or completing your grants. Oftentimes, the request for proposal will break down each section by the number of points or the weight of each section. So the budget section is usually fewer points. In federal grants, maybe sometimes like 5 or 10 points. But a good, well thought out budget does make a difference, and you do not want to leave any points on the table. When funding decisions are made based on literally point by point, you don't want your budget to be the deciding factor of if you made the cutoff line for funding. So as grants are becoming more and more competitive these days, every point counts, and the budget section, if you follow the simple instructions, is a good way to maintain those points. So number one, follow instructions. Usually the budget section is very specific about what is allowable and what is not with the funds. So number one, do not ask for 1 cent more. If this is often used as a pre-screening for grant consideration. So before they'll even review your narrative, there's a list of criteria that they'll go through. And so if the proposal says the maximum request is $50,000, and within your budget you request $50,055, that's already a pre-screening X that won't allow you to actually get to the next point. So really follow the proposal maximum request. If there's a page limit, keep to those page limits. If there is a font requirement or a spacing requirement, follow those completely. If they provide you with a template, a budget template, use that budget template. Even if it is not the way you usually do your budget, spend the extra time to then put it into their format. So here is the first tip that is just really generalizable for your grant writing overall is really follow simple instructions. Another piece is, imagine that you're a grant reviewer. You just completed probably an 8, 9, 10-hour workday, and you volunteer to review grants. You have 4 to 5 grants to review and score based on the requirements of the funding announcements, and let's say by tomorrow that you have to return your scores. Help the reviewers out and make the answers clear and as easy to understand as possible. So don't make them find your answers, because in reality they may not find the answers or they may not even look. So again, think about that when you're writing grants, is that who is reading the grant is probably someone like you who is volunteering their time after their work hours. Make it simple, make it easy for them to understand so that they can best advocate for your proposal. Next slide. So, I know a good number of you said that you do have fiscal folks on staff, and I would highly recommend working with your fiscal folks in your organization when developing program budgets. Some often start with the budget when they start their grant proposal. This would then help them to see what program costs are needed to carry out the project and the staffing needs of the project. So again, the piece is alignment. Alignment from what you say in your narrative to the budget and what you propose in the budget back to the narrative. Again, make sure you read the RFP. You should brainstorm on all of the costs that will arise during the program implementation. Discuss as a group all the materials that will be needed to be bought throughout the program. What are the overhead cost? What are the incentives that may be needed? Think about every piece of the budget when developing your budget. Ask, is the amount awarded in the grant going to be enough to run my program in how I have explained it in the grant proposal? Also ask, is my program realistic? Here are some questions that can guide you to answer it, and that's on your screen right now. So, did you screen your proposal requirements? What's allowable? Are there any grantee trips that you need to factor in? What is the maximum award per year? How many years is this grant funding? Is there an indirect cost restriction? And we'll go into more about indirect costs later. How many staff can you actually fit into this budget? And do you know what the allowable and non-allowable costs are? Okay, next slide. So now I want to move us into, we've talked about what is a budget. Now let's talk about the anatomy of a program budget. So in an anatomy of a program budget, you have direct expenses and indirect expenses. Direct expenses is usually broken down into two main categories: personnel expenses and operating expenses. Within personnel expenses, then you have your project staff wages and your fringe benefits. And within operating expenses, that usually includes travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, construction, and other expenses. So other expenses could be publications, conference registration costs, any other contracts that may be there. And then, so total direct expenses plus indirect expenses will be your total expenses. Okay. I do have a question for you. We're not going to go to a poll. But, what is often the most expensive line item on the budget? So is it personnel? Is it travel? Is it equipment, supplies, contractual, construction, or some other expenses? Think about what answer you would say. So usually what is the most expensive line item of the budget is actually personnel. So personnel expenses is the biggest and most critical category in your budget since it takes staff to make things happen. Okay, next slide. So line item budget. So, this is really what the funder wants is the line item budget, which is what I talked about earlier, is kind of using those categories. And it's this itemized expenditure. So it's some people refer to it as budget categories. The examples of budget categories are salaries, fringe benefits, equipment, supplies, travel, consultants, and contractual. When you're creating your budget, you can use these categories to organize your budget if a template is not provided. Okay. So always start your budget with personnel. Start with personnel and your proposed logic model. So the next couple of slides, it's going to be pretty text heavy, but I'm going to go through each of the anatomy parts of a program budget. So we'll first start off with personnel expenses. So again, start off when you have your budget with your personnel section and your proposed logic model, and ask, do you have enough funds for what you originally designated? You may have to go back to the logic model and revise the program model if it is unrealistic given the available funds. The two primary questions for personnel are, who will be funded and for how much time? A key piece to competitive wages is the need to offer a competitive salary. So utilize salary surveys to assess what is the going rate for the position that you're targeting. By offering low wages, it results in high turnover. If you want high quality staff to invest in your agency, then offer them competitive salaries and plan for the life of the grant. Breaking staff up into small percentages on every single budget is oftentimes a red flag to auditors and to program officers. So think about that as well as when you're creating your program budget. Also be careful what you promise with in-kind contributions of in-house staff. Do not promise too much because some funders will really hold you to that, to the T on what you've provided for in-kind in-house services. If from the proposed budget it seems realistic that maybe a key staff person, such as the director, will be providing guidance or supervision to the project, then go ahead and put them into that. But just be careful about how you're putting that into the budget. One major aspect I often see on program budget is that it's too top-heavy with senior management staff that actually should be included in-kind rather than in the budget. Okay, think about the rates of these key staff and how even putting a portion of their time impacts the overall budget. Also think about the key staffing patterns that you will need to effectively implement the program. Oftentimes we forget about support staff or staff that can input data. Those roles and responsibilities are critical to the success of the program. And so are you allocating the resources to the appropriate level? Okay. Next slide is about fringe benefits. So fringe benefits are applicable to direct salaries and wages. They include medical, dental, vision, FICA, unemployment insurance, workers' comp, long-term disability, and retirement. Fringe benefits should include info about the rates of fringe benefits and the basis of your calculation. So on the next slide, I give you an example of a fringe benefit breakdown. The next slide, please. So note that this breakdown is based on an agency that uses an overall fringe benefit rate of 33.7%. As you can see, each specific fringe benefit has its own percentage rate assigned. Costs related to fringe benefits are usually calculated as a percentage of salary because that's how federal and state mandated fringes are calculated. Okay, so this is just one sample of a fringe benefits breakdown. Next slide. So now we're moving into operating expenses. Operating expenses are also called direct costs. So travel, right? For travel, always include staff in-state and out-of-state travel. Out-of-state travel includes per diem, airfare, and a hotel. So I recommend looking at the U.S. General Service Administrator per diem guidelines as a guidance. So just go online and just type that in, and you'll see the per diem guidelines that the federal government uses for each state, and then in each state, key cities. Again, read if there are any grantee meetings that you would need to allocate funds for within your budget. A lot of times that may be overlooked and you didn't factor in those costs, but because it's in the request for proposals, that is still your responsibility that you must send staff to maybe key meetings or grantee meetings. Okay. Equipment. So this is typically associated with program equipment that's over $5,000. Usually anything under $5,000 goes under supplies. Supplies include office supplies, program supplies. I encourage you to know the basic rules of supplies versus equipment. If you're unsure, ask the program officer or contact on the RFP. All RFP requests for proposals, all requests for proposals have a contact information, and please, their name is there for a reason. Contact them if you have any questions. Grants, there's often two contacts, a programmatic person and a budget person. So of course, go to the budget person if you have that question. So on this slide, the first budget category here is contractual. So this category is appropriate when hiring an individual or company to provide professional services or advice for a fee. That's not an employee of the grantee organization. So examples are translation services, transcription services, an evaluation consultant. Maybe you need to hire a consultant to develop a curriculum. It could be a consultant to help with your communications or your IT. So contracts happen in many different forms. Construction, new constructions of project, be very, check, be very clear on the grants if they are providing funds for construction. And then there's usually another category, and this category contains items that are not listed in the previous budget categories. Things that fit in here can be telephone, postage, internet, equipment maintenance, and rental. Okay, next slide. So on this slide gives you a sample cost allocation plan. So what I've given is just a sample of a plan for community garden, a hepatitis B program, and maybe to support a fiscal administration team. So if you can click, all of the things that we've highlighted today is related to direct costs. Okay? So as you can see, everything is related to direct costs. Next slide. So again, a quick summary of the total direct costs. Total direct costs are those that can be identified specifically with a particular final cost objective. So a particular award, a project, a service, or other direct activity of the organization. Total direct costs equals personnel and operating costs. Okay, next slide. So now let's move into what is indirect cost. Okay, so as you see in the proposed budgets, all of from salary to other was direct cost, and then there's an indirect cost line. Okay, next slide. So indirect costs are those that have been incurred for common or joint objectives, but cannot be readily identified with a particular final cost to the objective. So it's not directly accountable to the cost of the project. So an example of that would be like your central office, or your business services, or budget and planning, safety and risk management. On the bottom, you see source OMB Circular A-122. I encourage you to look in there. That gives you all of the regulations and the definitions of these vocabulary. Next slide. So indirect cost. So to claim indirect costs for organizations, you must have a federal approved indirect cost rate agreement. So for federal, so you will work with an application to get approved your cost rate agreement. Each organization may be different. So for federal grants, that's what you should do. On some foundation grants, they already say you can include up to, for example, a 10% indirect cost. So if for an example of to calculate indirect costs, if you're applying for a foundation at 10%, and I know you would never be applying for a $100 grant, but let's use that example. The direct cost is $100 times the indirect rate, which is 10%. So your indirect cost would be $10. So next slide. So on the next slide, then your total expenses would be that direct cost plus the indirect cost, which would be equal to your total expenses. So if we use the example of $100 as your direct cost, $10 for your indirect cost will lead to a total expenses of $110. Okay. So again, this webinar is a very basic level about what is the budget. We've gone through what is the budget, what is the anatomy of a budget, and now we're going to end with budget justification. So budget justification is for you to justify each of your costs. It provides sufficient narrative about each cost. The narrative should not include any surprises. So your narrative should direct your budget. Your program narrative should direct your budget. If there was no mention about a need for transportation to get the children in your after-school program to your site, then how can you include funds within your budget justification for a 16-passenger van? The grant reviewers will follow again from your narrative to your budget and your budget back to your narrative. So Juliet will be speaking very soon, but when I'm working on grants and I talk to Juliet, who does the budgets for our grants, one of the first questions she always asks me is, Marianne, I need to see the narrative, right? And so that's, again, really making sure that the narrative is aligned with the budget and the budget is aligned with the narrative. There are three main key issues here. One is, does your budget match your program, which is what we just discussed? Does your budget match the guidelines? So be very careful, again, to read the budget instructions. And are you asking for what capacity you have? So that's just something that you check within yourself, that if there is a $150,000 grant available, it does not mean that you have to ask for the full $150,000 if you do not have the capacity to handle that level of funding. If you have that capacity, by all means ask for that, for the full amount. But if you've never gotten a grant for over $25,000, then is it really reasonable to ask for a $150,000 grant? Think critically about your infrastructure, and if you can ramp up quick enough your finance and administration department or your team in order to respond to that level of grant. Next slide. So sample budget justification. So in the interest of time, and I really want to allocate more time to question and answers, this is a sample of the detail that is needed for your program budget justification. So if you look at the translation service one, translation services will be used to ensure that all materials created are done so in a number of commonly spoken languages, including Vietnamese, Cantonese, and Mandarin. That summary will have connected to what you've already spoke about in your narrative about the need and your project objectives and your activities of what you're going to do. And so there's that connection. And then it gives the detail about the rate, right? So calculate it at an average rate of $50 an hour with a 1 hour minimum for 40 hours. And that's how you were able to get the $2,000 that you're asking specifically for budget justification. Okay, next slide. So the next slide is about allowable and unallowable expenses. Again, read your request for proposals to follow guidelines on what is allowable and what is not an allowable expense. This may differ between federal and foundation grants. Some examples of allowable or unallowable expenses for different groups is lobbying, food and meals, it often depends, entertainment, political activity, religious activity, promotional items and incentives, stipends, gift cards, guest cards, bookstore gift cards. So again, all of these, in some grants it's allowable, some grants it's unallowable. So definitely check with your request for proposal. Also, if you're working on federal grants, again, look at AR-122, the circular and the super circular for that guidance. Okay, next slide. So the true test, if someone cannot understand your project from reading your budget, it still needs work. Okay, so always think about that true test. I'll hand it over to Marietta.
Thank you so much, Marianne. So our guest speaker today is our colleague, Ms. Juliet Espinoza. Juliet is the Senior Director of Finance at the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. She has over 30 years of grants administration and nonprofit accounting and financial management experience. Prior to joining the Health Forum, Juliet worked for a federally qualified health center holding various positions in fiscal management. She also worked as senior budget analyst for a university corporate office where she successfully managed the budgets and funds of outreach programs and the medical school program of the university. Juliet has also worked as grants and contracts administrator for a federal research facility where she managed National Institute of Health and Department of Defense research grants and contracts. Juliet has a diploma in mechanical engineering technology, a bachelor degree in business with emphasis in accounting and finance, and finally a master's in business administration. Now I would like to welcome Juliet to share her 5 real-time budget tips.
Thank you, Marianne. So the 5 tips I have is use models. The best models are budgets from similar successful proposals produced by your colleagues. These models can provide the budget categories and estimates of some of the costs. Be generous and comprehensive but realistic. Don't construct a bare-bones budget. Do not shortchange yourself. Bare-bones budgets and unrealistic budgets can diminish your credibility in the eyes of a prospective sponsor. Understanding the proposed project goals and activities will help identify all possible cost items and their cost estimates over the life of the project. Use your own past experience and the experience of your colleagues. Get estimates of cost from vendors about the cost of certain items that are new to you, such as special equipment or special printing of publications. Use an appropriate format. The format of the budget is very important. Most sponsors require an itemized budget, and many sponsors prescribe a special budget form or format for proposals to their organizations. This prescribed format should always be used. Request only budget items allowed by the sponsors. Know and read the sponsor guidelines. Asking for unallowable or disallowed item creates a poor impression of your application. An example is asking for food for meetings in case of federal grants, or lobbying costs, or application of indirect cost rates beyond the maximum allowable in case of foundation. And the last is bright, thorough, and thoughtful justifications. Don't give the sponsor an opportunity to cut the budget due to a poor justification. The justification information demonstrates a thorough and thoughtful budget preparation, especially in the case of personal possessions and major expenses requested. This builds credibility in the eyes of the reviewers or sponsors, thus increasing the likelihood of funding. That's all the 5 tips I have, and I'm going to give this back to Marietta. Thank you.
Thanks again for sharing your useful tips, Juliet. Now I'd like to go ahead and address some of our questions from our guest today. My first question is, general operating grants are really hard to find. Do you have any suggestions on how to fund administrative staff?
Thanks for the question, Marietta. Juliet, I'll start, and then if you have anything else, please add. So yes, general operating dollars are very hard to find. A lot of times program requests for proposals, they want to fund the program, but we also know that in order to support the program, we need to be able to support the larger health or the larger agency work. So knowing that, I would say yes, continue to talk to funders, build those personal relationships, find grantors and funders who have provided general operating dollars in the past to other agencies, and I would pursue those locations. Another thing that I know that nonprofits do is also they become very creative about their fundraising, right? And so if the grants are going to support their programming, then if they have fee-for-service, if they have fundraisers, if they have other ways to bring in money that's unrestricted, that's how a lot of times they're able to support their general operating cost. Juliet, any other additions or thoughts to that?
The other addition that I'd like to make is if you have developed expertise in your organization, providing technical support to other organizations maybe is another area that you would like to consider to raise funds for your organization to support your projects. So that's all I have, Marianne.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Is there an unspoken rule of how much of your budget should go to personnel versus operating expenses?
Juliet, do you want to start?
There is no written rule as to the percentage of the budget should go to personnel or operating expenses, but generally if it is it is a service organization, it ranges from 60 to 75% goes to personnel and the rest goes to operating expenses. There are some also federal grants or some other grants that will not allow you to use consultant services that is more than the cost of your personnel cost. So it depends on what the rules are of or the guidelines of the sponsor.
Yeah, I think, Juliet, I would have actually said the same thing, is that a pretty large majority of your grant budget will probably be personnel. Earlier I did ask the question about, when we're talking about the anatomy of the program budget, what is the most expensive line item of the budget? And it is the personnel, because it's the most critical category, because it really takes staff and it takes people power to make things happen.
Yeah, I think that is very true, particularly for service organizations, except if you're providing probably meals or that part of the program wherein there's a bulk of the expenses is in supplies, maybe. So then that could turn around. So if it is service organization not providing a lot of supplies to the community or to the their contingent to your community, then that is more on personnel. Yeah.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. I work for a multi-service agency and do not know how I should be estimating shared costs like rent, telephone, and internet. Do you have any tips?
Juliet, would you like to start?
Well, the way I've always estimated my shared cost is based on historical data and also based on what I project as a cost in the fiscal year or the year that covers the proposed budget. So for historical data, for example, if my rent, and then I divide that by the number of FTEs, and that would be my cost. And then if I know that there is I'm anticipating a 5% increase in my rent, then that would be based on historical data, and then plus my number of, plus the increase, and then also then the number of FTEs that I anticipate in that fiscal year. So that is basically how I estimate the cost of shared items.
Yeah, I think that's a really great that's a really great tip, Juliet. I've also done it in the past where it's the funding amount is the percentage of the total budget. And using that as a way to figure out what is that contribution for that program to, what is that contribution of that program to that over a larger, for instance, rent or utilities or internet or something like that.
Moving on to another question. Can either of you please discuss cash match?
Marian, do you want to answer that since you talked about matching contributions to the program?
Sure. So a lot of times, grant proposals will ask for a match. So it could be a cash match, it could be an in-kind match, and so when you get that, I would say I think don't shortchange yourself. Think about all of the resources that may not be actual dollars coming in to your agency that you can count as a match. So it could be, again, like I mentioned earlier, volunteers. It could be donated space. It could be donated supplies. Depending on the request for proposals, they may actually ask for that cash match, meaning what other grants do you have, right? And so that is also very critical. If it's a one-to-one match and you're asking for a grant of $50,000, then if they're asking that you then show proof that you have funds coming in from another foundation or agency that's supporting at $50,000. What I've done in the past is I've actually copied the award letter and actually put it into an attachment that gives them proof that that you do have a match fund to be able to do this project.
Our next question. Do you include a contingency amount? If so, is it embedded into the budget or does it become a line item? And finally, how much is a reasonable amount?
So contingency. So I guess I would love to kind of talk to you more about what do you mean by a contingency plan, and what kind of budget that, or like what could be included in the budget. What I think about when you say contingency plan, and correct me if type it in if I'm answering the question to what you asked. But to me, it's like, so what happens if you ask for a $50,000 grant, but you only get $35,000 or $40,000? What would you do? How would you adjust your program? Sometimes there are sections in the grant proposal where they will ask specifically what would you do if you get less dollars. But a lot of times, my experience is that if you were to ask for $50,000, but you actually got $35,000, then there's that time in between where I actually talked about earlier that there's a space for you to have budget negotiations, and then within those negotiations, you will also usually then kind of reevaluate your objectives that you proposed, and knowing that if you propose to reach 100 people at $50,000, and now that you have $35,000, that you would have to lower those numbers of not being able to serve maybe 65 or 70. Julia, any thoughts about contingency?
Yeah, actually, for including what is to be included in the, do you include a contingency amount? Normally, it is so hard to justify a line item for contingency, just that contingency. But what I normally do, as I said earlier, is to anticipate possible increases. So for personnel costs, I don't really know if there's a personnel increases, maybe a COLA. So sometimes whatever is the plan, I would normally put about 2 or 3% increase beginning whatever period that you normally give a COLA to a person or to your personnel. So those are my contingencies. I sort of included in each of the line items.
Thank you, Marianne and Juliet. Moving on to our next question. How do you know what rate to charge for indirect costs and when? If you already have a indirect cost agreement, then you should apply that unless your grant says, or federal grant says we would put a limit. And for foundations, normally they would dictate how much indirect cost you could include. Under the new super circular, they would allow a 10% indirect cost rate for if you don't have an indirect cost agreement, but they're supposed to honor whatever indirect cost rate you have now or indirect cost agreement you have with the federal government. Thank you. How about
Julia,
you, Marianne?
I was going to say, Julia, could you walk through the process of federal level for indirect costs, just broadly? What is the process like?
Well, for us here in San Francisco, we have the Indirect Cost Allocation division of the Department of Health and Human Services. So you should be applying to from the government that actually has your major is the major grantor for us is the Department of Health and Human Services, Indirect Cost Allocation Division in San Francisco. So you send them your proposal, and it is basically proving to them what is your indirect cost. So there are instructions on how to create an indirect cost proposal, and then they would send you an agreement once they review that, and then that becomes your agreement. Normally it's applicable for 2 years, and in all your federal grants applications you would apply that amount, and they should be honoring it. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to another question. How should funds already committed from my organization's budget be reflected in the proposal? Does it help or hurt the application to show what my organization can commit as a way to indicate need?
So I will start, and Julia, please add more. What I have budgets are actually, there's a column that says total budget, and then there's another column that says budget request. And so then the reviewer is able to see what is the total budget versus what's the budget request, so that they can kind of compare how much you need to raise and how much they are contributing to it. And then you can also then, I've seen, and then kind of the part two is that I've seen also another table where they'll actually talk about income, and then you'll show what grants you've received and the amount of money, and then you can also put in the budget request, or you'll put in the foundation that you're asking for money from and how much you're asking from them, so that they can also see in that chart how much you have already gotten and how their funds can help support that even more. Does it help or hurt the application? I cannot give you a full 100% yes, it helps, but it does. With reviewing grants, they want to know that their funding is the only thing that's going in to support this project, and it's really for sustainability, right? If it's better to have 3 or 4 funding sources to support the project versus one funding source. If that one funding source would pull out, but you have 3 other funding that you had to support the program, then the program can continue, and that is sustainability. If it's just one funder funding one program solely, if that funder were to leave, then what happens to their project? That is not good for the agency, and it's also not good for the foundation as well. Juliet, anything else?
No, I think you've covered it all. Thank you, Marian.
Okay, I see one last question in our questions panel, and that is, how do you calculate fringe benefits?
The fringe benefit is, as Marian said, it's a percentage of your cost of the benefits, a percentage of your personnel cost. You could also do an estimate. So if this year you know that you're increasing the cost of health because it's continuing to increase, and so therefore you could put an estimate based on that. But also in our case, we also have a fringe benefits cost rate, which is also part of our agreement with the federal government that we could apply to all our proposals. So that is also, again, you could turn that in and to the Department of Health and Human Services Division of Cost Allocation, and you could again also you could also put in your estimate, and they would also give you 2 or 3 years worth of rate that you could apply in any of your grants. The only thing, though, that you need to be very careful of when you're applying the Fringe Benefits rates in your federal grants is they would audit you the following year because you need to turn in your reports. And to make sure that whatever you've applied should be, your actual cost should not be less than what the percentage of what you've applied in your federal grants. Anything else, Marian?
No, Julia.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Marianne and Juliet, for sharing your knowledge on budgets with us today during our last webinar of our three-part grant writing series. Everyone, you will be receiving the slides and evaluation shortly. We just request that you please fill out the evaluation as it will be very helpful in informing future webinars. Please our Capacity for Health online resource library, as it has been very useful in providing information for our three-part webinar series. The address is www.capacityforhealth.com. And finally, if you have any questions that were not addressed today, please feel free to contact Marianne directly. Last but not least, visit the Health Forum website, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. We hope that you enjoyed today's webinar and gained some useful information that you can apply to your work. Thank you, and happy Wednesday, everyone.